Open is good. So I'm going to be quick about these spots. Obviously, raising's great. I think sizing's fine. When facing a 3-bet, it's very player dependent, to be honest. When I'm being 3-bet versus certain opponents who 3-bet way too much and have too many bluff combos, I'm going to consider 4-bet jamming this. And by bluff combos, a lot of people use suited wheel aces. Those are the most common 3-bet bluffs, maybe ace-9, ace-8. And the benefit of jamming is even though they're ahead of you, they're not going to call a 4-bet shove. So you're going to take this pot. Also, if they start 3-betting too many small pairs, or medium pairs even, is someone going to 3-bet call pocket 7s here? I'm not so sure. And so the higher someone's 3-bet percentage is, the more likely your 4-bet shove is going to get through. So I'd consider jamming this hand. But versus most people, I am going to do what you did and just call. The hand flops well, and even though you're not in position, pretty on most king or queen X boards, you are going to be flopping top pair and feel relatively decent about your hand. It being suited means you can flop more backdoor equity with a backdoor flush draw, in addition to the backdoor straight draw, which you can always flop. So overall, I think your decision to call so far is good. Only versus the nittiest players would I consider folding. And they have to be really tight because the price you're getting is great. You're getting, calling 3.5 into 10. And so unless they had a range, I thought, of aces, kings, queens, ace, king, ace, queen, I'd really, and then I'd fold against that. But most people are going to be 3-betting wider than that. And if they're too wide, you can punish them by 4-bet jamming. Otherwise, I would just continue with the call as you did. All right, so far, also good. You decide to check call flop. I think that's perfect. A lot of people want to just get the money in now because they have top pair, but the range of hands you're going to get called by is mostly those that beat you. Better hands are never folding to your shove, but a lot of worse hands are. And so even though check calling might not tell you where you're at, a lot of people like to use that term, what you're doing by check calling is keeping your opponent's range wide. And that means they have more room to bluff. So if my opponent decided to 3-bet ace-5 of clubs and bet the flop, well, he's only drawn to 3 outs. I want him to keep bluffing. If my opponent has pocket 7s, 2 outs. And if my opponent has pocket queens, I'm dead either way. If I shove, it doesn't mean that I'm gonna, I'm not gonna lose the hand. And if I call, I'm still gonna probably lose the hand. And part of it is just kind of accepting that when you're beat and when you get coolered, or I'll call it a cooler, but when you have a really great hand in a spot and your opponent has a slightly better one, you're probably going to lose. And you have to just kind of be okay with that. And the reason you end up calling here is to keep their range wide, to allow them to bluff, and that overall gets you more value long term than just shoving. So I like this. And then you check the turn and he jams. So I think this is probably the part where you had the most questions about. And I can't tell you how your range looks, but I can take a wild guess here based on how the hands that I would have. So I would have ace-queen suited some of the time. I would have king-queen suited some of the time. Queen-jack suited some of the time. Those are my top pairs I would have. I probably would have queen-9 suited very, very low frequency. Queen-10 suited a little bit more. And obviously when you have a hand like, we'll say for some reason you have pocket 10s in your range as well, or you trapped pocket queens, or you trap pocket aces, those are pretty easy calls, right? Like when you have the nuts of your range, it's really easy. And when you have the bottom of your range, like we'll call it king 10 of clubs, then it's a pretty easy fold. And so the hands that get difficult are the ones in between. And that's, I think, where a lot of the money is made in poker. It's like learning how to navigate with these medium strength hands. And so if I'm deciding here, like the hands that are either a call or a fold are pretty much my top pairs, right? Those are the ones that aren't traps and they feel a little too strong to fold. But which top pairs do I want to call? Right? So I said you might have, we'll say ace, queen, king, queen, jack, and I'm going to exclude queen nine. But I'll just say this about queen nine. If I had queen nine here, feels pretty close. And the reason I'll say that is because when you're deciding whether to hero call, you want to think about what value hands does my opponent have, and what bluffs does my opponent have. If you're up against an opponent who just never bluffs, then this hand kind of feels gross, but it's probably a fold because they're never bluffing. If you're up against an opponent who bluffs a lot, this hand's a really happy call because they bluff too much. So if I don't know anything about my opponent, I'm going to often use, I think he's a reg. So I'm going to use what I think a reg would be bluffing in the spot with, what sort of combos. So let me start with value hands. I feel like I'm all over the place here. So value-wise, I think my opponent's going to have aces, kings, queens, ace, queen, pocket tens. Those are the hands I'm most afraid of. So I would like to block some of those hands, because if I have, we'll say we have king, queen here. Well, that makes it less likely he has pocket queens, and makes it less likely he has pocket kings. And those are two of the 5 or so value hands I mentioned. If I had I'd said queen 9 before. Well, I block straights, and that's why it kind of felt close. But I don't block other value hands, and how often is he actually betting, 3-betting jack 9 and 9-7? So that comes down to your reads on what his 3-betting range look like. But I will say that if your opponent is 3-betting jack 9 and 9-7, suddenly they have a lot more weird bluff combos they might have. Maybe they do have king 9. Maybe they do have ace 7. Maybe they do have ace 9. Maybe they have random spades. So I think versus I'll say a normal opponent, the normal bluffs I expect them to have are actually more like ace king, ace jack, king jack, and then ace X of spades. And the other part of blocking their value is unblocking the bluffs. And so if I think his bluffs are spades, then if I had a hand here like king, queen with the king of spades, I wouldn't feel as good about it as I do king, queen, no spade. If I had a hand here like trying to think of a worse queen. Basically, if I have queen jack, for example, queen jack has more equity if he has aces. But it doesn't block any of his value, and it actually blocks him from having a hand like ace jack or king jack. I want him to have a jack in his hand, right? So I don't want to have a jack in mine. So overall, I think that even though you might feel in this spot ace, queen, and queen jack kind of feel the same as top pairs, I would much rather have ace, queen, or king, queen. And the reason is, well, a big part of his value range is aces, ace, queen, kings, pocket queens. So I'd like to block an ace, a king, or a queen if possible. And king, queen, or ace, queen feel like hands that block his value, unblock enough bluffs, and there's always a small chance that your opponent value shoves worse. Meaning that maybe he 3-bet queen jack of clubs and decides to jam the turn. Maybe he 3-bet pocket jacks and decides to shove the turn. So I think that you are blocking some of his value, unblocking bluffs, and there's a chance that someone value shoves worse. So I would call this. And one last thing to consider is that a lot of people feel really defeated when they call and they're behind. But you don't need to be right every time here. You need to be, basically, you need to have 33% equity because you're calling 20 big blinds into 20 big blinds. Those are your pot odds. So I know in this spot he has pocket tens and you have 0% equity, and that's pretty bad, right? Like 0% is pretty bad. But there are other times where you're going to have, let's say they have aces and you have somewhere between 15 and 25% equity, depending on suits. I guess here you'd have like 15. But let's say they have ace king and you're ahead, king jack and you're ahead, ace five of spades and you're ahead, queen jack and you're ahead, pocket jacks and you're ahead. So even though sometimes you're going to have 0% equity, there are times where you're going to have over 50. They're like way over 50. There are times you're going to have 100 if they're doing something really crazy. I guess 100 is kind of hard. But let's say 90% if you're up against ace four of clubs. I think closer to 70% if you're up against like ace X of spades. Like my percentages here are a little bit, I'm just kind of pulling from thin air. But my point is that even though here you have 0 equity when you called, if you think about how their range looks and if they are bluffy enough, this is going to be a very profitable call. And it's not, again, always about getting the money in good. It's about getting the money in good enough versus their range, having enough equity versus their range. So it comes back to pre-flop. What do we think their range looks like? How bluffy are they? And if you can make an exploit and say, this opponent's 3-bets a lot, but they don't bluff big streets later, or they bluff too much, or they overvalue second pair, weak top pairs, that can really help you out make your decision. But overall here, I think you played this hand fine. I think even though people wouldn't consider a top pair versus set often a cooler, I think in this spot it is. I think if you had a hand here like king, queen with one spade, maybe you can get away from it because you block some spade draws. And so that takes away some of his bluffs. If you had queen, jack, you could say, yeah, I've got a straight draw, but I don't really block enough value hands. Because as I said, the value hands we're most afraid of, aces, kings, queens, ace, queen, pocket tens. We can't block them all, but we block enough with king, queen, and ace, queen, I believe. So, unlucky. Nice hand. You played it in a way where you get max value against their bluffs. And unfortunately, this time he had it. Nice hand.